Sputnik 1 was a turning point in history because it launched the world into the technology age and sparked the furious competition between the US and the USSR that pushed the world into a frenzy of scientific and military advancements while also introducing the media as a primary weapon in intercontinental conflict.
The story of Sputnik began in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference. A temporary American alliance with the Soviets against Hitler and the Nazis turned into a fierce rivalry as the conflicting ideologies of the two major world powers clashed. Space was seen as the next frontier, and the governments of the West and the Communist bloc were suspicious of each other because of the new paranoia inspired by the atomic bomb. In July 1955, at the Geneva Convention, President Eisenhower proposed open skies that would allow nations to fly intelligence aircrafts over any other country. The USSR rejected the proposal, and Eisenhower responded by saying that the US would launch a satellite. The USSR countered by saying they would as well. In a memorandum from a July 1955 meeting of the National Security Council, it was determined that there should be the gravest repercussions should the USSR achieve an operational capability with the ICBM. The International Geophysical Year, IGY, a scientific extravaganza that lasted from the 15th of July 1957 through the 31st of December 1958, was when both the US and the USSR launched their satellites under the guise of scientific advancement. German scientist Werner von Braun had an army team that could have launched the satellite at least 2 months before Sputnik, but President Eisenhower went with the Navy's Project Vanguard to represent the United States in IGY instead. Eisenhower was more concerned with the declaration of space as international territory for his future plans to launch spy satellites. Because the Russians launched the satellite first, they gave the US permission to put their own satellites in space. On October 4th, 1957, the news of Sputnik was announced at an IGY conference, and scientists everywhere celebrated not a Soviet victory, but a human victory. However, this euphoria didn't last long in the United States. At first, Sputnik was not considered a major threat to the US. A Gallup poll showed that only 50% of the population thought Sputnik damaged the American reputation at all, and only 13% thought that Sputnik meant America had fallen dangerously behind the Soviet Union. However, top government officials were quicker to brand Sputnik as a threat to American superiority. The result was the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, under President Eisenhower as a result of the Space Act passed by Congress in 1958, and the subsequent increases in NASA funding under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. The money given to NASA was used to fund private contractors in creating new equipment for the space race that was now in progress. The reaction by the government and media sent the US population into somewhat of a panic. Meanwhile, Russians displayed the Americans as ugly magpies, distorting the beautiful voices of other countries, who were nightingales. This propaganda was in relation to US imperialism and capitalist influences in other countries. So when Sputnik was launched, the Russian people celebrated a victory over what they saw as a flawed elitist institution. Initially, the USSR was successful in defending its advantage, pursuing the Vostok and Soyuz programs after Sputnik. These programs produced the Soyuz spacecraft, which is still in use today. However, in 1966, the head of the Russian space program, Sergei Korolev, died, and the US eventually pulled even. Before the launch of Sputnik, the US saw itself as the world power as a result of its victory in World War II and development of the atomic bomb. Thus, when Russia announced its intention of launching a satellite into space, the idea was largely regarded as ludicrous, as Soviet technology was not considered as advanced as that of the US. Consequently, space programs in the US were almost immediately reinforced after the Russians managed to beat the US to space. Newspapers reported that United States must catch up with the Russians in rocketry quickly. The pride of United States scientists had been wounded, and they now expressed a determination to catch up and overtake the Russian space program.
At first, the media did not display Sputnik as a threat to America or her people. Citizens from all over the world gathered together where Sputnik would pass overhead, watching for a glimpse of the man-made moon. The New York Times said nothing of military matters and even praised the Soviet scientists for, quote, approaching the launching of the satellite with modesty and caution, end quote. As the euphoria of the great triumph wore off, the media began to question Sputnik's impact on the United States' safety. Scarcely 6 weeks before, The Kremlin had announced the development of an ICBM that allowed them to direct rockets into any part of the world. The U.S. had discounted these remarks, but the launch of Sputnik forced authorities to take these words into deadly consideration. The Chicago Daily News expressed the concern that, quote, "The day is not far distant when the Russians can deliver a death-dealing warhead almost anywhere on the earth." End quote. Comparisons were drawn to Pearl Harbor, the first shots fired at Lexington, and Columbus discovering America. Once the implications of Sputnik set in, the public began to panic. Sputnik 2 was what the West needed in this war of propaganda. The Soviets were branded as monsters once the public realized that the Soviet scientists had sent Laika, the lovable first astronaut, up, with no intention of bringing her back. Yet, in December 1957, what should have been a reprieve for the U.S., turned into a disaster as the Vanguard rocket crashed and burned mere seconds after liftoff. This was the opening scientist Wernher von Braun needed to convince the government and the public to fund his program, which successfully launched Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958. There were several direct scientific advancements as a result of Sputnik. Sputnik 1 itself did not pick up much useful data, but Sputnik 2 monitored the life signs of the first living organism in space, Laika, while Explorer 1, the first U.S. satellite, discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. NASA, which was created as a direct result of Sputnik, has made some of the most prolific advancements in the scientific community, the most recent being Curiosity, the land rover NASA sent to Mars. However, Sputnik's long-term effects unearthed more scientific advancements than just those from its first few years. Most notably, satellite technologies have led to the cell phones, GPS systems, and other gadgets we take for granted. However, one of the most significant repercussions of Sputnik had nothing to do with science. In 1975, with the world watching, astronauts from the Russian Soyuz and the American Apollo united their ships, and Colonel Leonov welcomed the Americans with a "glad to see you." This was the first step in moving away from the threat of a nuclear war, a step Sputnik opened the door to 18 years before. The successful launch of the first satellite into space marked not only the beginning of the space race, but also the space age. Today, the United States and many other nations, including Russia, have satellite capabilities, and these nations have the capability to send satellites into space for research as well as commercial ventures. These combined space programs create massive research satellites such as the ISS, the International Space Station. Not only has the launch of Sputnik had a revolutionary impact on technology, but it has also endured as a lasting and meaningful metaphor. President Obama, in his 2011 State of the Union, said that the current condition of the U.S. was a Sputnik moment. This simple statement shows just how much Sputnik changed the world. Sputnik is now a classic example of a shock, something unexpected, something that changed the world.